Hi, and welcome to the Bible Matters podcast. My name is Tiff Carter-Whitley, and in this episode, Leo and I spoke to Gwilym Davies, a preacher at St Helens Bishopsgate, about the first few chapters of John's Gospel, chapters 1 to 4. We chatted with Gwilym about the themes that come up, about the structure, and what we're meant to take away from those initial chapters. We really hope you enjoy the episode. This is the Bible Matters podcast, encouraging you in faithful Bible teaching and ministry.
Well, it's a wonderful pleasure to be joined once again on the Bible Matters podcast by Gwilym Davies, come today to talk to us about John's Gospel. Gwilym, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Last time we spoke to you and William about the whole of John's Gospel. Today we've just got you. William's been fired for a sub-average performance. No, I'm joking. He'll be back.
He's coming back later, isn't he?
He will be back later. Yeah. But we'd love to get your insights over the next couple of weeks on the first half of John. So in that first episode, we talked about the structure of John, some big ideas. You kind of suggested that there's maybe a sort of halfway point and subsections within that. So we're going to talk today about the first of those subsections, which I think is generally chapters 1 to 4. Yeah. Now, one thing you said in that first episode is that we often talk about John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31 as a kind of purpose for the gospel, and that's good and right. But you said that sometimes chapter 1, the start, is a little bit overlooked. And I just wanted to start by asking you what you meant by that.
Well, it's funny. I mean, it's a passage that I go quite far back with. I remember when I was in school, we had this. I just went to a comprehensive school, but it was completely not Christian. But we had some carol service in December every year, and the head teacher, who was this Northern Irish guy with a slightly embarrassing surname, actually. But anyway, he used to insist that he did the lesson for the last of the lessons. It's kind of 9 lessons and carols, and it's always John 1 to 18, and so it's slightly etched on my brain that it should be read in a Northern Irish accent.
You're very welcome to if you want to.
No, I don't know if I can. And then I did A-level RE, and we did John's Gospel for half of my A-level RE, so it was John was half of it, and our RE teacher made us all, all 5 of us, we all had to just learn the prologue by heart. She's like, every year there's always a question on John 1 to 18, so just learn it by heart. And so I guess I'm sort of primed to think that it might be quite a good idea. But I think it's just obvious, isn't it, that John's Gospel begins in John chapter 1 and not in John chapter 20, and if you're reading it for the first time, you don't get to John 20, 30 and 31 until you've read 20 chapters. And if it's a good summary of the purpose, and I think it is a really good summary of the purpose, then it is drawing together things you'll have been seeing the whole way through, and that's obviously true. And I found it enormously illuminating for me to kind of have John 20, 30, 31 in the back of my head as I talked through it and everything. But I guess it'd be mad not to kind of also be mindful of the way John's actually started. Because that's the first thing you encounter. It's this extraordinary thing, and straight away he kind of puts a whole bunch of things on the table that are really important, I think, for understanding what comes next.
So John, he could have put John chapter 20 verse 30 and 31 at the start.
Like Luke more or less did, right? So it's like Luke basically begins with a purpose statement. And again, in Acts, it more or less begins with the kind of resumptive purpose statement. But John begins with this prologue, with these kind of this 18-verse, extraordinary 18-verse opening. And I guess that's going to be quite important for how you then read what followed.
Do you think it's meant to direct how we understand what follows? Is that the reason for it being up front?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, partly theologically, and so again, I guess anybody who's read John 1 will know straight from the beginning that it's hard to miss the kind of the allusions back to the beginning of the Bible in Genesis. In the beginning was the Word, and all things were made through him, and it's very hard not to be hearing Genesis 1:1, Genesis 1:3 as you start it off. And so again, we begin with the fact that this is the Creator God, and we're not going to be surprised if it turns out that John's Gospel is a book about a new creation kind of work from that. And I think Dick Lucas, he I think says that that's the big thing in John, that John's all about new creation. That's the central theme in the book.
Are there any other things from John 1 to 18, which you're supposed to have in mind, which will help you as you go through the book?
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I think when you get to verses 14 to 18, the allusions there are less to Genesis and more to Exodus. And so the Word became flesh and he tabernacled amongst us, and we've seen his glory. And then no one's ever seen God's. The law came through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And lots of people have suggested, I think Don Carson says this, that little pair, grace and truth, should remind you of steadfast love and faithfulness from Exodus 34. And so then this image in Exodus 34 of the glory of the Lord's passing by Moses as the Lord is choosing to dwell in the tabernacle amongst the people and declaring his compassion and his grace. That again, that is kind of key backdrop to kind of go, okay, so this is a bit like that, but so much better that no one's ever seen God. It's like that this is kind of almost like a whole new thing. And so I guess kind of if you were to say Jesus is the creator who's come to bring new creation, he's the kind of the Exodus God, sort of his people's savior and king, who's come to bring new Exodus salvation. You know, that's kind of right there up front. Yeah, and then there's also that little thing, isn't there? He gave the authority to become children of God. And again, I think that's a really big thing in John. I'm currently, I've just finished teaching a module at Cornhill Plus on kind of John's Gospel and the doctrine of the Trinity, and trying to think about how our understanding of the Trinity comes out of thinking hard about a book like John in its kind of Bible context. And one of the things I was really struck by is that in John's Gospel, in the end, the whole thing is driving towards the Father. And so for the first kind of half of the book, it's really important that Jesus has come from the Father. But the second half of the book, he's going back to the Father, and he's giving us a Father. And so, like, he says in the farewell discourse that I don't say that I will ask on your behalf, because the Father himself loves you. And then in John chapter 20, he says to Mary, I'm going to my God and your God, to my Father and your Father. John 21, he appears to the disciples and says children, and calls them children there, 21. And I think, again, that's the idea that one way of talking about, what Jesus has come to do is to give us his Father as our Father. That's set up right at the start of the gospel, but you might miss it otherwise. So
it's helpful. I think you did say this in the last episode, but as I re-listened to it, I found it really helpful. But I think what you're saying now and what you said then is, as we read these things, I think they're there, or you said they're there because we are to assume they're true, which means that when the Pharisees are calling out Jesus or whatever, it's not really as if they're being fair, because actually we have established that Jesus is the Word who was there, the Old Testament God, as it were, the Exodus God come to the world.
Yeah, and I suppose what John has done is to kind of compress like a whole load of Old Testament theology into quite a short chunk at the beginning of the gospel. To help you to know what they should have known if they knew their God. So if you knew the God that they knew, what would you know about the person who's standing in front of them? And then again, it's not like John, the Jesus didn't walk around with a guy who had the prologue reading it out in front of him everywhere he went, and so it's not as though the Pharisees actually heard in the beginning was the Word as Jesus was walking around and that kind of thing. And so in a sense, you could say as readers, we're kind of an advantage. But then actually you realize that almost everything that John says in 1 to 18, John the Baptist says about Jesus as things open. And then Jesus has these signs that show that that's true of him. And so by the time you get to kind of, this is racing ahead to next time, I think, by the time you get to chapters 5 to 10, the religious leaders really have all the information that we have in John 1 to 18 available to them from the Old Testament and from John the Baptist and from what they've seen in Jesus, if they choose to kind of believe it, and they're deliberately suppressing it. And I guess John wants to get us up to speed right at the beginning to be like, look, this is what you should understand about who Jesus is and where he's come from. and that will help you to understand just how extraordinary what he's doing is.
I'd love to ask you more about, I guess, those verses concerning John the Baptist and actually the rest of chapter 1, really. Because I think this is right. We touched upon it last episode. Some people think that the whole of chapter 1 might be a prologue. I genuinely don't know your thoughts on this. I think one way or another, the second half or the latter verses in chapter 1 are often a little bit ignored. You get 1 to 18, which are these colossally important verses. And then you get some, kind of strange verses, really, particularly about, seeing Nathaniel under the fig tree, which seems to change his life and those sorts of things. So I'd love to just ask you about those verses and how they're contributing to maybe the prologue or the rest of the gospel.
Yeah, so I think, I would agree that the whole of chapter 1 is kind of introductory. I think I'm fairly happy. I think most of the consensus in the kind of the wider world of what people write about John is that 1 to 18 would be kind of what you'd call the prologue, and then 1:19 sort of starts, if you like, the narrative proper, and that's when you kind of leave aside this kind of poetic fanfare and you actually begin telling the story of what Jesus did.
And
the narrative starts in 1:19.
You get times and places and things
exactly.
like that.
People who are going to be important in the book that's following. I mean, like, basically, it's when you start the story.
Sure.
1:19. You have this kind of sequence of days where you meet, first of all, John the Baptist, and then you meet the disciples through John the Baptist. And increasingly, as you read through 1:19 to sort of into chapter 2, that John the Baptist kind of gives way to the disciples, actually, over the course of the week. But of course, at the heart of it all is the arrival of the Lord Jesus. Again, very striking that he's not there on day 1. So it's like day 1 that is just kind of John, and it's this extraordinary interrogation where it feels like they're almost putting John the Baptist on trial for not being the Christ. It's an incredible opening. And this first quote from the Old Testament, again, John doesn't quote from the Old Testament very much in his gospel, and if you compare it with some of the others, he tends to allude to it a lot, but his quotes are relatively spaced out. But here you get this first big quote from the prophet Isaiah to sort of set expectations for everything that's coming. And then Jesus arrives. And there's this great kind of thing the whole way through, like, come and see. So I remember I preached on this I think it was I can't quite remember what I must have done. I feel like maybe we had a week in Singapore. I was involved in the campus ministry, and maybe we had a week when we expected none of the freshers would have turned up or something. And I did 1 to 18 that week or something. And then the first week when we thought that it might be kind of open season was 1:19 to 51. And it makes a great kind of intro talk, because this refrain the whole way through, just come and see, come and see. What you're going to see is going to be amazing. Like
that Old Testament quote you alluded to, I'm the voice of one crying out in the wilderness. Is the purpose there, this is the kind of heralding in of the Lord's, or?
Yeah, I think so. So you've got John the Baptist, who, again, and this is going to be important all the way through chapters 2 to 4, that John the Baptist, we said last time a bit that he kind of, it's not that he sort of allegorically is the Old Testament, that he's a book wandering around or a box of scrolls, but he kind of gives voice to the prophetic witness of the Old Testament. And so because of that, his kind of theological significance is that he's like the Old Testament witness to Jesus. And it's very striking that the very first thing that John wants to say about John the Baptist is that he is not like the Messiah, the Christ, the goal, the end of all of these things. But he is this witness to the one who's coming. And I think all the way through John 1 to 4, that's going to be important, actually, that the Old Testament is not the end of the matter. Like, you understand it rightly when you see it as the thing which is preparing the way for and witnessing to and climaxing with the arrival of the Lord Jesus Christ.
That's very helpful. So the almost comical bit where John is saying, I'm not, the point is actually the answer is to come. It's still coming.
And that's the first thing that John says about it all the way back, isn't it? So there was a man sent from God.
Yeah.
He came as a witness. He was not the light.
Yeah.
But he came to bear witness about the light.
There is more to see here. That's very helpful. And just very finally, again, just slightly strange bit about Nathaniel and the fig tree. I think it catches me off guard. It catches people off guard. Any thoughts about that?
I mean, I've got a fig tree in my garden.
How lovely. Because of this passage.
Yeah, well, probably not really. It doesn't really have any figs on it, which if I was studying Mark, that would be more relevant.
My fig plant at home is completely dead.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
You're doing better.
Lots of curses upon your trees.
Well, it's a great bit, isn't it? Again, it kind of, William talked last time about this bit being about the Christ of history, and you just kind of get that up front, don't you, from Philip, where he says, look, we found him of whom Moses and the law and the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph, in verse 45. And so just up front, it tells you what we're saying in chapter 1 is that this is the one the Old Testament was talking about. Again, just on the face of things, without any kind of Old Testament sort of background, whatever, it's just obvious that Jesus is saying to Nathaniel, whatever you have seen so far is nothing in comparison to what's coming. So again, it's a great thing with narrative that just reading it on the face of it and going, like, just in front of your face, what's there? Well, they have this slightly odd conversation. Jesus obviously knew more about Nathaniel than Nathaniel expected. Nathaniel's quite a fun guy, isn't he? He's kind of quite a straight talker.
Yeah.
And then Jesus says, I saw you under the fig tree. He's like, wow, you're the Son of God, the King of Israel. I never quite know what his tone of voice is there, but anyway.
Okay, yeah. You said it quite sarcastically there, but...
Well, no, I suspect it wasn't sarcastic. I suspect it was entirely sincere. But it always feels...
the King of Israel.
It always feels a bit like, a little bit strange that knowing that would be the thing.
Sure.
And then Jesus says, but you've not seen anything yet. You're going to see much greater things. And then actually people have detected, and I think they're exactly right, that you should be thinking all the way back to Genesis 28 and this kind of very significant scene in the life of the patriarch Jacob, where the Jacob's ladder bit, where Jacob is fleeing from Esau, his brother, and he has this dream at night. He lies down and lays his head on a stone, all of this bit, and then he has this vision of this kind of ladder, or perhaps it's a sort of a staircase, or sort of maybe a ziggurat or something, and these angels going up and down on it. And he says, like, surely this is the house of God. I never knew that God was in this place. It's a very kind of foundational moment for him. And I think people have rightly detected that is kind of in the background here. And so the idea of an Israelite indeed in whom there's no deceit, but of course Jacob's name meant the deceiver, and we kind of know that back in Genesis. And then what you're going to see is heaven opened, which is what, of course, the first Israelites Jacob saw, and the angels of God ascending and descending, but not on a ladder, sort of between heaven and earth, not sort of on Bethel, whatever that would mean, but actually on the Son of Man, that he is in fact the ladder, the kind of the thing that is uniting heaven and earth. And that, again, I think, is this right? I think that's the first time in the gospel that Jesus describes himself as the Son of Man. And that's going to be a really significant title for him in John's gospel, and a way of talking himself precisely as the one who has come from God, from eternity, from heaven, and is incarnate as a man, and is going to die on the cross. Like, as I say, whenever he talks to himself as the Son of Man, it's driving towards what's the reason why I've come to be a man, and to die. And it says that here it is because this is going to be the thing that bridges heaven and earth. Yes, it's an amazing opening, actually, to the gospel.
Come and see.
Yeah, come and see.
Gwilym, I have here a little piece of paper which you gave me months and months ago when we were sat in Pret-a-Manger and we were talking about John, and you drew the structure of John. I don't know if the camera will be able to pick this up.
Amazing.
This is definitely like a
looks
kind
like
of
a bird.
Yeah. It does. It looks a bit like a dove, actually. I mean, It's very symmetrical. I think that's one interesting thing about it. We talked a lot about this slightly incomprehensible diagram last time. John is kind of symmetrical in its structure. But you've done little blocks to represent what you think are kind of segregated blocks of John's Gospel.
Yes.
And, well, we've got chapter 1, 1a, 1b, and then we've got 2 to 4 here. And I think we said last time the reason why you think 2 to 4 is a section is because it is bracketed by these 2 miracles or signs. So you've got the water into wine and then healing the official's son. Can you just talk a little bit more about why you're convinced this is a section? Is there more to it than the fact it just happens to have 2 miracle brackets?
Yeah, and this is not a particularly rogue or kind of RML 1997 sort of a view on this section. So I think I mentioned that I did this A-level RE where we did John's Gospel, and we were given all of these commentaries by Smalley and Lightfoot and various others. Actually, when I first turned up at St Helens, I was doing Read, Mark, Learn, and we were doing John that year, and I was a first year student, and I turned up with my highlighted copy of Fenton every week. I mean, can you imagine how much of a pain I was?
Ready to teach all the leaders.
It's extraordinary.
Your A-level.
I was in this grief as well. It's an incredible group. It's incredible not least because my name was not the least plausible name in this group, but also
I presume you can't say what the least plausible names were.
Well, we just had we had a Stephen King, which is a great name. We had a Matthew.
Nice.
It's incredible. That's right. But anyway, and the other thing that's slightly funny about the group is that you do these sessions on Bible study group dynamics, and you have all these kind of, what if you have a silent Sally in your group, or what if you have a sort of a talkative Trevor or whatever. Anyway, you can imagine where I might be on that sort of spectrum.
Bobby Gwilym probably.
And basically I was put in this group where it was me and a whole group of silent Sallies,
Oh wow, okay.
Your poor leaders.
Anyway, and I was there with my Fenton. But I remember that we had this quote that we were supposed to learn. I think it was Oscar Cullman, but this is like 25 years out. I can't remember now. But he said that John 2 to 4 is a microcosm of the gospel as a whole. And this is kind of mainstream 20th century Johannine scholarship. So I think this is not a weird idea. It's a section.
Yeah, sure.
But I guess we did mention the sign brackets, and that kind of makes sense. It begins and ends kind of in Cana. Again, like in both directions, there are kind of interesting connections you can make, as in lots of people have pointed out that 119 through to 212 probably narrates a kind of a week that you're supposed to be able to count the days, and that the 7th day is John 2. And so it bleeds a bit that way, but that kind of works sense. In a sense, it's kind of like a drum roll that kind of climaxes with the beginning of the first big section. And then there's a really interesting book by a guy called Craig Kester on the symbolism in John's Gospel, and he's pointed out that actually there's some interesting things you can notice if you compare the healing of the official son in John 4 with the healing of the lame man in John 5. And so again, also interesting. But that doesn't stop you from saying, okay, but basically these are sections. It's a narrative, things connect.
I mean, and it is one book rather than 5 different books or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. People have noticed things like you have these 2 sort of long kind of one-to-one interview discussions between Jesus and a sort of a would-be disciple. So Nicodemus in chapter 3, and the Samaritan woman in chapter 4. And again, a lot of people have noticed, again, this is just mainstream, I think, that if you put those 2 conversations side by side, there's a lot to be done in terms of a compare and a contrast. And how, both in terms of what you'd expect from them, a man and a woman, an Israelite and a Samaritan, somebody with a sort of an apparently flawless background and pedigree, somebody with a very checkered history, somebody coming at night, somebody in the middle of the day. As you can carry on this, and yet the responses run completely the other way around, doesn't it? Nicodemus leaves, I guess, we just don't really know what happens, but he leaves, I guess, befuddled, confused, and unbelieving. And the Samaritan woman leaves trusting Jesus and a witness to the first great evangelist in the gospel. If you sort of divide it up with the geography markers as you go through the section, what you then kind of land on is that you have this encounter between Jesus and the disciples of John the Baptist, at the end of chapter 3, and that kind of becomes this sort of central pivotal point right in the middle of the section. So I think once you kind of, once you go with the sign brackets, so lots of people notice that, at least for this section, even if they don't notice any other sign brackets, they notice it for this bit. Lots of people treat it as a section. And then it does kind of work, actually, as you kind of go, okay, so
yes, so
Cana, Jerusalem, Samaria, Nicodemus, the woman, and in the middle, John the Baptist bearing witness.
So the section itself is actually very structured.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, yeah.
And I guess then the big question is like why? What is that structure actually pointing towards within this section?
Yeah, great. And I think it's really significant that you have that bit with John right in the middle. We've already talked about the way that John the Baptist witness is important in the prologue, and it's the way that John begins in 1:19 and following with the testimony of John. And we've noticed that in some ways that kind of forms an umbrella all the way to chapter 10, and John the Baptist comes up again in chapter 5 and in chapter 10 as well. He's kind of name checked in those chapters. But in this first section, I think it's really striking that right in the heart, right in the middle of the section, you have this question about John. And in particular, it's kind of exactly that question that we were just on a minute ago. So should his disciples feel bad that the effect of Jesus' arrival seems to be that people are defecting from John to Jesus? Is that a problem? And that's kind of the question. They come and they're like, Rabbi, the one that you bore witness to, look, everyone's going to him.
So that's chapter 3, verse 26.
It's rubbish. He's really stealing your market share. And John is like, well, no, of course. That's exactly what it should be, because he must increase, I must decrease. As in, like, I'm the bridegroom's friend. My job is to bear witness to the bridegroom, but the bridegroom's here, and then the Son has arrived, that he who comes from above is above all. And so, of course it's the case that the Son should have everything, that God's given everything to the Son, and that you should receive his testimony, and that my job is to point to him, and the Son's kind of arrived, and he's the heart of everything. And then I think that actually, sort of, if you can take that as two sides of a coin, so either the positive or the negative side of the coin, that I think is what the whole section's about. So kind of positively, isn't this amazing? The one that we've been waiting for ever since the beginning. He's finally come. He's here. Praise God. Joy, a wedding. Believe, as in he's arrived. And then the flip side of that, but he's so much bigger than anything that you might have kind of imagined.
Yeah.
I was teaching John chapter 2 to 4 to some international students a while ago. And this is the kind of the illustration I came up with, that like if you imagine that you had a kind of an iPhone box or something, obviously, Apple make good boxes, right? The kings of the box. And I don't know what they do, what kind of magic it is, but that whole thing where it feels like there's some sort of pneumatic system.
I know what you mean.
Kind of like, you know what I mean? Like if you could open it, it's like it sort of feels like it must be, I don't know, electronic, cushion, something. I mean, it's just good cardboard, isn't it? But I say, if you wanted to own a box, it feels like owning an Apple product box, just for the sake of owning a box. It's kind of up there in the best boxes one could own.
For sure,
But as I said to these people, like, imagine that you got given this box, you might enjoy it for a bit. I think my children would definitely enjoy these boxes for a while. And then imagine that, for whatever reason, you got given a later iPhone or a later iPad or whatever it was, and the dimensions are slightly different, and it wouldn't fit in the box, and so you chuck out the iPhone or you chuck out the iPad because it won't fit in my box. And maybe part of what's going on in this bit of John is that we're seeing that it's amazing that the Son has come, the bridegroom's here, but it's going to break some boxes, and there's going to be some stuff that won't fit.
And is that kind of what you're seeing with Nicodemus? Because again, it's almost like an interrogation, really, isn't it? And he's kind of asking all these questions, but I suppose it just doesn't fit in his box, is it?
Yeah, that's right. Again, one of the things that the geography helped me with was that I think I made the call. Originally, I would have read John 2, 1 to sort of 22 as a section, and then taking the Nicodemus bit of starting at John 2:23. But then I was kind of struck, well, hang on a second, let's just do what I do in Mark, whatever, and cut with the grain of where stuff happens. And very clearly you have this thing that's in Cana in John 2, 1 to 12.
So that's the wedding,
And then 2:13, he goes to Jerusalem, and everything from 2:13 through to 3:21 happens in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And I think that means that John is kind of encouraging us to read this as basically a section.
Okay, sure. And it is significant, I suppose, you know, the Messiah riding into Jerusalem, or even Yahweh himself coming to Jerusalem.
Yeah, exactly. And Nicodemus, the section begins, as we were talking last week, in 2:23. The bit with Nicodemus starts with this introduction about these people who believe because of the signs he'd been doing at the Passover feast. But Jesus not entrusting himself to these men. Now there was a man from the Pharisees named Nicodemus. And he goes, well, okay, so which signs? And then Nicodemus comes talking about the signs that God's doing in 3:2. Well, which signs are they? They're the signs at the Passover feast. What signs at the Passover feast? Well, the description of what Jesus did at the Passover feast starts in 2:13. And so you kind of, this bit with the cleansing of the temple in 2:13 and following, what Jesus then goes on to talk about just goes seamlessly into the Nicodemus section. And I think I've got David Helm's children's Bible at home. And I think he was really good on this. I'm just in the bit on John somewhere in there. I don't know where it is. But I really like this. I can't remember how he put it, but he basically was saying that Nicodemus's problem is that Jesus has said some disruptive stuff. And I guess what he's kind of implying is all the stuff he said about the temple. And I think that's exactly right. I think that that's just David Helm reading John 3 as following John 2. The sort of the subtext of this conversation is, look, Jesus, I mean, you're obviously great. You know, these signs, wonderful. You must be man from God. You know, we're right with you. But this whole thing about, you know, driving people out of the temple, zeal for your father's house, destroying it and you raising it up in 3 days, all of this kind of stuff, this all feels a bit disruptive. Could we not have a kind of a less revolutionary approach to being a man sent from God? And I think basically the conversation that then unfolds in chapter 3 is a conversation where Jesus is saying, you have no idea like how much of a fresh start you really need. And if you even begun to understand your Old Testament, you would know. As like this is not news really.
Complete fresh start, born again, those kind of ideas.
Yeah, that's right.
And how then does that compare to the Samaritan woman, who you're saying is kind of mirrored in the conversation Jesus has with her?
Yeah, well, it's so interesting, isn't it? And like, you know, he's saying to Nicodemus, you know, you need new birth. Again, I think he's saying to Nicodemus, you should know this. I think everything in in chapter 3, verses 1 to maybe verse 12 is stuff that Nicodemus should know from the Old Testament. And so I think Jesus is just assuming, like you've read Ezekiel, like as you know that there's no way back for the nation without national rebirth, without the Holy Spirit, without a new heart. Like, I'm not saying anything that you wouldn't know from the Old Testament. Are you the teacher of Israel to understand these things? And then he said like, oh yeah, and here's some stuff you won't know. And then he starts to talk about what the Son of Man's going to do in the cross and all of those things. I think with the Samaritan one, it's so striking that their conversation in some ways starts less promisingly. And just like Nicodemus, she kind of can't make head or tail of what Jesus is really talking about. And there's this kind of this deliberate, semi-deliberate sort of taking Jesus literally. Like, you know, so like Nicodemus does it. Like, you know, born again, are you saying that I have to kind of crawl back into my mummy's tummy? And obviously that's the same with the Samaritan woman where, you know, she's like,
give me this water.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing. As you're promising me water that never runs out. Like, that's really cool. And like, but then she actually tracks with Jesus, and the conversation sort of carries on. And when he tells her that he's the Christ Messiah who's coming to the world. She believes him.
But do you think then the thing that she gets right is that she is willing to, I guess, be born again? She is willing to have that fresh start.
Well, she listens to Jesus, doesn't she?
Yeah.
She believes.
Yeah.
Which was way back in chapter 1.
Yeah,
Belief
that's right.
was the big thing.
Gives you the right to become a child of God.
Yeah.
Lots of people have talked about weddings, marriage in this section.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are on how kind of significant this is, but obviously it begins with a wedding. John the Baptist calls himself the best man, basically. And then lots of people have talked about, obviously, there's Jacob by the well. The well's
a dating scene.
Yeah, exactly. Good place to find a wife. There is something about, I don't know, maybe you know more about this than me. Is it Jesus kind of becoming the seventh husband or something like that to the women? What are your thoughts on it? Is it a significant idea?
Well, it certainly is important, isn't it, that it starts the wedding. I mean, it's just, again, just on the face of things, that is just such a striking thought, isn't it? And, you know, if you were sort of trying to write the gospel of the kind of the econ Jesus, who always did the thing that was of maximum utility, only did miracles that were most likely to help a hungry child and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You probably wouldn't come up with the wedding at Cana.
You wouldn't start with Cana.
Well, I just think it's just on the face of things, even before you've got any Old Testament background, any sort of understanding of like what prophecy could be being fulfilled here. I just think it's an incredibly appealing and joyful vision of the Lord Jesus, isn't it? That, that he was at a wedding, and he was at a wedding and made it better, and that he, again, I once read, I think I listened to a sermon from a church where they were trying to explain how the wedding at Cana was all about the fact that you should be teetotal, and I sort of struggled to see it. I struggled to see that Jesus is anti-wine from John 2:1-12. It's funny actually. I preached on this passage at my sister's wedding. It was a really fun conversation. So, she asked me to preach at her wedding, which is lovely. Yeah. And then there's a bit of back and forth about what I was going to preach on. And after a while, I sort of said, well, I wondered about maybe preaching on John 2:1-12. I preached it a couple of times before, and I just love this passage. And I wondered about preaching on this, the wedding at Cana, water into wine. And there's kind of radio silence for my sister for maybe a few days, a week or something. I was like, wow, I mean, what is the problem with John 2:1-12? Then she could have got back to me just like, do you think it'd be okay to preach on that given that it'll be an alcohol-free wedding? It's like,
you still went for it.
I did. Well, that actually made for quite a good introduction. That's right. So it's a wedding. Just on the face of it, that's kind of joyful. And then there's all these kind of expectations from the Old Testament, I guess, especially from the book of Isaiah, that the Lord is the bridegroom of his people. He's the bridegroom of his city, Jerusalem, and that she is this kind of bereft wife without children and without a husband, sort of languishing. But there's this promise that the Lord is going to come as the bridegroom, and that he is going to betroth his people to himself, and that it's going to end in a wedding and in a multitude of children and in kind of life and new creation. And I think that all of that is then in the background when you have this section where it starts with a wedding, and Jesus looks like he's doing the job of the groom. He's not the groom at the wedding at Cana, but he's kind of doing the job the groom should have done. And he's the one who's brought the party to this wedding. And then that's the way that John the Baptist seems to see it in the middle. He's like, look, the groom's here. That's that I'm just the best man, but the groom's arrived. This is what we've all been waiting for. I think that probably is kind of a big thing in chapter 4, that probably there are kind of connotations of these dating scenes from Genesis, and the husbands are on the table in the discussion, and that both has kind of, I guess, literal significance in the life of this woman, but also there's a sort of a theological background to that, and all of these kind of Baals that the Samaritans have worshipped. And that word Baal is just the Hebrew word for husband, actually. And so, like, all of that's kind of in the background. And here is Jesus, who has kind of come to, the Lord who's come to claim his bride, and the bride that he wants. And it's extraordinary when you get there, that this is indeed the Saviour of the world. And again, this is this big kind of Isaiah theme that as I live, every knee will bow to me, every tongue will confess. Turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I'm God and there is no other. And so here you have the Lord arriving, the bridegroom, and kind of claiming the world as his bride, something like that. So I do kind of think that's, I mean, how much you'd want to sort of major on that in chapter 4 or not, I don't know, but I think in the section as a whole, I guess it is one of the big metaphors.
We've said a lot of really good things, but I'd love to kind of just draw things together as we close on this section. Lots of amazing ideas, but what do you think, just to distill it down, what do you think this section of John is ultimately trying to teach the reader?
Yeah, great. I mean, I think I would basically say the big thrust of John 2-4 is that amazing, praise God, the Lord, the Messiah, the bridegroom is here, and that's incredible, and is going to be good news for the whole world, and it's going to be hard to take for people who are sort of want to hang on to their kind of their Old Testament structures, and their kind of the temple and that sort of thing. And I think you sort of see that as you go through. So in chapter 2, 1-12, he shows his glory. Look, the bridegroom is here, the fulfillment of all these expectations, and the groom says, doesn't he, that people serve the good wine first and then the cheap stuff, but you've saved the best till last. And I think, again, you're supposed to hear that. I think in each of John's Gospels, actually, there's something someone says at the beginning of the section that kind of means a bit more than just the face of this. And I think he's kind of saying, look, the best has now arrived, and you've saved the best till last. That's what God has done in the whole economy of salvation, that now the Son has come. You've saved the best till last, and we're there. And then he goes to the temple, and we realize that what this is going to mean is nothing less than shutting down the old temple system, which was unable to bring life and purification and peace. It was going to mean shutting that down and replacing it with the real thing, which is the Lord Jesus himself. And then you get this kind of discussion with Nicodemus, like, are you sure this is a good idea? And Jesus, look, you haven't even begun to understand how much you as human beings need a restart and need to be born again. You need nothing less, in fact, than the death and the resurrection of the Son of Man, if we're going to have life. And then John kind of saying, John's disciples being like, are you sure that you really want to back this guy? Like, you're losing all your followers. And John being like, no, but he's the one we've been waiting for, and he's the one we need to listen to, and he's come from above, and we know that he's right. Like, you've got to listen to him. And then in the Samaritan woman chapter, you then get this picture of not only this woman listening to him and finding life and this living water, but in fact, that rippling out to this whole world. And it kind of ends with this guy who, again, comes to believe that Jesus has the power to bring life from the dead. And
is this the official?
That's right. There's power to bring life to the dead and to save his son, even at a distance. And that's actually going to be really important. I mentioned that quote from Oscar Cullmann, I think it is, about John 1-4 being a microcosm of the gospel as a whole. And I think one of the ways in which that's true is you see that he comes to his own, and his own reject him, but the disciples see his glory and believe. But then you see that what the disciples see, as it's reported by the Samaritan woman, actually has the power to persuade and to save and to bring life, not only to those who first had the conversation or first saw it, but to anybody who hears this message. And because Jesus actually, because he lives, he has the power to save even at a distance. Doesn't it? That he does, it's not just the person who's when you're in the room with him. You can be far from him, and if he speaks, new life the dead receive.
Yeah, for those who believe in the word. Yeah, it's really cool, isn't it? I mean, I know this is such a no-brainer thing to say, but this is really well written, isn't it?
Gwilym, we've been seeing that the new bridegroom, the new covenant bridegroom, is here, and he's come to save his people in this different than expected way. What are some of the applications that are falling out of this for us reading it today?
I mean, people mean such different things when they talk about application, but I think, I guess I want to say, first of all, I'd want to encourage anybody reading John 2-4 and trying to think about what it means for us to just see the goodness of the Lord Jesus. And I think to be really persuaded that we think he's wonderful, and that we want to trust him, and that he's the one that the whole world had been waiting for up to that point. And we should still have that same sense of it's amazing that he's come for us now. I guess that's going to have implications. It means that we need to listen to him. That's a really big thing in John, and we need to listen to him even when he starts saying things that we would rather he didn't. There's this choice, like as in, would you rather have what you think you know, or would you rather have the kind of the joy and the life and the forgiveness, the purification that only the Lord himself can bring? So I guess that kind of that listening to him. There are sort of things that people have drawn out, and again, rightly, about worship and how we understand worship. And again, I think John chapter 4 is a really important chapter for seeing that New Covenant worship is not going to be something which is tied to particular buildings or particular places, but it's going to be something that happens wherever the word of the Lord Jesus Christ is proclaimed, and people kind of come to believe it all over the world, and it's going to be global. So there are big things to say about that. That's really important as you go through. But I think I'd want to start by saying, basically, just see how amazing Jesus is, and love him, you know, and love what he's come to bring.
Yeah. I guess the central bit of the section is John the Baptist saying, "Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete."
Yeah, exactly.
What a role model of how to deal with this section. For us, we may be teaching this, either preaching on Sundays or teaching it in small groups or reading it one-to-one. How have you gone about teaching this bit of John's Gospel? Any kind of things that you've learnt from in your time of teaching it?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I definitely think one of the things with John is there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on sort of literarily, if you want to pull on it. I tend to think that John is a bit subtler than some of my friends do. And so, I think things like, it is interesting to notice when things happen and what's going on with water jars and that sort of thing. And so there are sort of things going on there. There's Old Testament stuff in the background, and I guess people have rightly noticed that you can pick stuff up from Isaiah and from Hosea and from Genesis and from Zechariah and from Ezekiel and
the whole of the Old Testament, basically.
Well, exactly, that's right. You're kind of going through and Genesis in a big way, and I think that you can slightly kind of get lost in that when you're teaching a book like this. And I think one of the temptations as a Bible teacher is to think that you're sort of justified by your ability to show people things that they wouldn't have spotted on their own or something. That your aim is...
or to make them think it's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So it's either to show them something they've never seen before from a Bible passage, or your aim is to show them a detail they hadn't noticed, or to kind of overwhelm them. And so if you almost like, you should pay me to be a Bible teacher because you don't know the Old Testament as well as I do. And we actually had, there's a guy called Greg Beale, who is he's a big scholar on Revelation, and his life's work in some ways has been to help Christians to think about the New Testament's use of the Old. And we interviewed him for one of the modules we're teaching at Cornhill on Friday. So that was quite fun.
Nice. In person or remote?
Yeah, over Zoom. So yeah, that's right.
Zoom.
So we had a nice chat with him. Nice. And he was talking about this this new study Bible that he's been involved in developing, which is basically a kind of a connecting the dots study Bible or something, where kind of every quote from the Old Testament and the New, it's basically just the New Testament, but every quote from the Old Testament will be in kind of blue or something, and every allusion will be in green in the text. And then under the line at the bottom, it'll tell you where it's from and what the significance is. And he was very excited about this. And I was thinking, quite a lot of preachers will suddenly feel like they are no longer able to justify their salary.
Out of their jobs.
Because it's there now, the book's published. And I just think at all of that, you just need to do restraint at this point. I'm just going to pull back and just going to go, no, listen, all of that's really cool and it's really exciting and it's wonderful. And you want to share some of it. But I do just want to sort of also be able to show people just what's there on the surface of things. Like, what Jesus actually, the most important thing is that Jesus actually did this stuff and he actually had this conversation. And he actually did this miracle. And that's just there on the face of things. And John is actually making big points here. And I want to make that clear. When I first preached through it, I hope I can say this. This is the sort of thing you're not supposed to say on the Bible Matters podcast, I think. My prep practice as I first preached through John, this is, again, it's when I was in Singapore. And I just remember every week, I basically started by reading the RML book on John. So there's a Read, Mark, Learn book on John, these notes that William wrote, I think, back in the 90s on John's Gospel. And the first one was to read it and kind of go, I just feel a bit frustrated. I feel a bit frustrated that, but there's like stuff that hasn't seen, there's kind of like literature stuff, there's stuff that's going on that's not there. It feels a little bit kind of simplistic and a bit rigid. And then my process over the course of the week was that I'll toss the RML book to one side, and I'd kind of do all my prep in John, and I'd read all these commentaries, and I had Ramsey Michaels, and I had my Borkham books, and I had my Carson commentary, and I had Andrew Lincoln commentary, and Kostenberger, and whatever else it was that I had in front of me, Ridderbosch. I had all these commentaries in front of me. I'd read them all. I'd basically get myself into a proper pickle. So I'd kind of get to sort of 2/3 of the way through the week, and it's like, I've got no idea what's going on here. And I'd pray about it, and I'd think about it, and I'd really try, I've got to get clear, what's the purpose of this passage? What's the big thing it's saying? What's my main point going to be? And I'd finally get there. And then I'd kind of just go back to the RML book, and I'd read it. I'd be like, that's what it says there. So that's kind of it's quite a chastening year for me in some ways. And I think that just kind of goes that, it's really cool when you're teaching John to see all this cool stuff going on. It's really cool. It's like, oh, wow, it's like a wedding and a bridegroom. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. But then actually, at the end of the day, if you're going to teach it well, you want that kind of that simple clarity. Yeah. This is the big thing John's saying, and this is the big implication. I think coming back to those kind of, life, faith, identity themes as you go through John, I think it's just a really good guide, actually, to just kind of go, I want to just help people to see how this is fitting in with the big picture of what John's doing.
I remember the first time I read John's Gospel, I think it was just in my quiet times, and read it without commentaries, without any help. And I remember getting to the end and thinking, gosh, there were a lot of words in that Gospel. But this offer of life, I was like, there was life from the beginning to the end on offer. And it was a wonderful truth to mull on every day for a month or however long it took. There is a wonderful simplicity to the gospel of just enjoy what is there on the surface.
And like people have said that there's a quote that everyone loves to wheel out for John, and I've heard it attributed to at least a dozen people, I think.
I think I know what you're about to say.
I think I might too.
The one about elephants and babies. Puddles. That's right.
Elephants and babies.
Yeah.
That a child can crawl in it, but an elephant can swim. As kind of Sun Tzu once said or something, Plato, Socrates, I don't know, Augustine,
every man
Don
on
Carson, somebody once said it. Actually, quite a lot of, almost everyone has said it at some point. But I think there's a real truth in that, and I think one of the things that just happens in John all the time is that because you have these conversations between Jesus and a kind of a would-be disciple, and because you have all of these kind of whoever or the one who or anyone who statements. You have these, they're kind of, I guess they're like sort of, you could describe as aphoristic sayings, as in there. It's sort of a one-liner that kind of works on its own, just as a one-sentence thing. You can it kind of gives you an offer or something. Even if you separated it from the context, you shouldn't separate it from the context. But even if you did, you kind of get this. Like in John 3:36, whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him.
Or 3:16 has probably the most.
Yeah, God of the world. Whoever believes in Him, exactly. And if you put that on a calendar, it kind of means the same thing as what it means in context. You kind of go, you kind of get it. I think because of that, there is just this directness that all the time you're being given things that, even if you're not kind of totally clued up about everything that's going on in the background, just speak to you and say, okay, so are you going to believe, and do you want life?
When you've been teaching through John's Gospel, how have you found people have enjoyed it or been challenged by it? We were saying in the last section of this episode that there is a real challenge. Jesus is not quite who we may think he may be, or he doesn't quite fit into our box. How have you found that the people that you've been teaching John to have been challenged or enjoying this bit?
I've loved teaching John 1-4. In some ways, the bit of John that is kind of harder to teach is the next bit. And so John 5-10, it's both more challenging, I think, in terms of being able to present the whole package, I think, and I think it's easier to sort of miss bits or to kind of either to miss out the good bits or to miss out the hard bits, I think, in that bit. And what it's saying is very confronting for people. Although now I've also had some great joy teaching that bit too. I think generally speaking, I have lots of really encouraging stories from teaching through John 2-4. I remember I gave John 2:1-12. We used as an introductory talk for our Bible study year for international students a few years ago when we were going through John. And so I gave this talk at the start of the year on John 2, kind of 1-12. And I think my first point was Jesus is good. And my second point was that Jesus is kind. And my third point was that, Jesus has come to bring new creation life or something like that, whatever it was. And maybe a year or two later, we were interviewing somebody who'd become a Christian in the international things, and it wasn't me interviewing, but she was giving her testimony, and she's just like, I first turned up and I wasn't a Christian. I just had this talk where Jesus was good and Jesus is kind. I was just like, it's amazing. It's like, this is cool, isn't it? And so I preached at my sister's wedding and on the same passage. And again, I remember talking to one of my my aunts, actually, who's at my sister's wedding, and again, just like hugely encouraged by just kind of looking at John 2, and I think the fact that one of the points I'd made in the talk was that it's not about the wedding. So if that kind of makes sense, that that Jesus didn't come to weddings to say, aren't weddings great? And obviously Jesus does think weddings are great, but that wasn't the point. Actually the point was Jesus is good, something better than anything that you could get at a wedding. That's like, there's a girl who came to talk to me, just like, it's so good to be at a wedding where, the sermon said it's not about the wedding. So I think I've really loved teaching this part of John, and I think really enjoyed seeing people wrestle with the goodness of Jesus and what he's come to bring. I think that John chapter 3 has also been a place where I guess people have first begun to get to grips with the fact that Jesus isn't tame and that he's going to confront us. And it's quite striking, isn't it, that John 3:16 is enormously famous verse, that it comes in this context where Jesus is talking about the fact that Nicodemus has got it wrong, and that he knows what's in a man, and then this is the verdict, that light has come into the world, but the world loved darkness rather than light because its deeds were evil. And I guess I have also seen that of people sort of first getting that the gospel was actually challenging them as they're going through John 3 and kind of going, oh wow, Jesus is saying some hard things.
Brilliant. Well, Gwilym, it's been so helpful to pick your brains about this section of John. I'm massively looking forward to, well, what you've just described as perhaps a slightly more tricky section next time, in looking at chapters 5 to 10. We'll be speaking to you next week all about that. And I'm sure it'll be enlightening. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast today to talk to us more about John 2 to 4.
Such a joy. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Bible Matters podcast. If you've liked this episode, why not like or subscribe wherever you've been listening, or share it with anyone who might find it helpful. You can leave us a comment or get in touch to let us know what you think, and the details on how to do that are in the show notes. The Bible Matters podcast was produced by myself, Leo Elbourne, as well as with Tiff Carter-Whitley. This is the Bible Matters podcast, encouraging you in faithful Bible teaching and ministry.